I'm very eclectic. When you look at favorite writers, you're looking at of the modern era, and by modern era I mean the last 50 years, because writing goes back hundreds of years. So you look through all this different literature of theirs.
Yeah.
Clive Cussler is the guy that got me really into modern fiction. And I read a novel that it was years after it came out that I read it called Raise the Titanic, and got hooked on his writing style.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that respect, Cussler probably is the modern writer. I mean, obviously I've read Brown and everybody else too,
Yeah.
but I'm probably more influenced by Raymond Chandler from the 30s and 40s, great detective writer. A writer that people have heard of but do not associate necessarily with his books, which is Earl Stanley Garner, who wrote Perry Mason in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yeah.
Because they're familiar with Perry Mason, they don't ever think about how many books there were Perry Mason books that were out. You look at Earl Digger Beers, who wrote Charlie Chan.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go back to my favorite author of all time is Mark Twain.
Yeah.
And each of them brings something different to the table, but there is a certain thing I've learned from all of them, but I don't necessarily write like any of them.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, as we've talked about in the past, my writing has been more influenced by the people who wrote in radio dramas in the 30s and 40s, because I discovered those when I was starting to write novels, and thought, okay, the rhythm and the pacing works so well.
Yeah.
And so you look back at that, and you're looking at people like Blake Edwards, who were writing radio at the time, and Dick Powell. And so obviously they influenced me just as much. But if I'm reading, I don't read fiction near as much as I read biography.
Really?
I read biographies more than any other form. I'm fascinated by people. It doesn't make any difference if it's a baseball executive like Branch Rickey from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Hattie McDaniel, who first African-American who won the Academy Award.
Phenomenal person, yeah.
The two biographies I've read on her are very interesting. Most recent biography I read was probably on Carol Landis, who nobody's heard about, but who was an actress who committed suicide in 29, but she did more for the war effort to entertain troops than anybody in World War II, even though Bob Hope and everybody else gets a lot more credit. Landis traveled more miles and took more risk.
Yeah.
And came back much more deeply scarred. Possibly the post-traumatic stress syndrome, which they called shell shock back then.
Yes.
Of her experiences is probably what led to her early death. So I'm influenced by those styles as well.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of nameless writers who wrote those detective shows that I will listen to them and do that. Finally, the other one is probably Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Love the man. I mean, I grew up reading he and Jules Verne.
Same.
And both of them impacted my life a great deal. So the love of mysteries goes back to Holmes.
Yeah.
Now, you say all that. I'm also impacted greatly in my writing, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, by a Canadian television show called Murdoch Mysteries.
It's a good one.
They started filming their 18th season yesterday.
Very cool.
The writers on there do a very good job of bringing historical figures into their program. And so they'll find somebody who was visiting Toronto in 1910, and they'll go back through newspapers, find that, and do that, and stick. Well, here's Mark Twain visited in this year. Let's put Mark Twain in this. Or Alexander Graham Bell was here. A recent episode I had the inventors of the Harley Davidson motorcycles. Harley and Davidson were there visiting Toronto. Let's figure out a way to work them into the story.
Yeah.
To tell their backstory. It could be Mary Pickford, Helen Keller.
Yeah.
All of those people are included. And so when you write historic fiction, they've kind of pushed me to inject more real characters into my work as well. So there's definitely an influence there too.